Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Maisris Pedikei Halacha Beis. We're learning today Daf Mem Beis. We left off on Daf Mem Aleph Amid Beis, 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid. Our Mishnah began by telling us that there is a rabbinic prohibition of selling, imagine, attached produce to a person who is not a chaver, if that produce reached the stage of oines hamaisres, as we learned yesterday. We're going to begin today by quoting a braisa that quotes the shita of Rabbi Shimon that disagrees with our Mishnah, that does allow the sale of attached produce. At the end of the day, as we explained, the prohibition is because of lifnei iver loisit and michshel, and it's self-understood that there has to be some limitations to lifnei iver. Right? Because you can argue that when I do this, I cause that, and that causes the other thing. And at some point, if someone is not observant, that might cause that person, or it's going to be a significant likelihood it's going to cause a person, to be violating, God forbid, one of Hashem's rules. There has to be a limit. And the Rabbi Shimon holds that if the produce is detached, that's where you say you can't sell it to a person who is suspect of not properly removing the tithes, because they might not remove it, and then I'm guilty of placing the stumbling block before the blind. But if it's attached, there is no such a thing. And on that theme of what's the limit of lifnei iver, and also what is the consequence for someone who violates the lifnei iver, we're going to see that in the beginning of Daf Mem Beis. Now, the Gemara is going to move on to the next case in the Mishnah, in which a person sold either straw or olive or grape residue, as we explained yesterday. And the chiddush of the Mishnah is that when the original owner, when the seller removed truma, dafka, because of the fact that truma doesn't have to be given, should not be given by an exactitude, it's approximately, let's go with the echad mechamishim. So the owner has in mind not only to be mesaken the pile, the owner knows that when it comes to grain production, you have a couple of stalks that did not get properly threshed, you have a couple of stalks that might be outside the pile. Like in this case, you have a couple of kernels that might be in the straw, that the kavana of the seller, of the original owner, was to be mesaken it all. And we're going to dive into specifics of what were to happen if a person was the simply person and the only separated echad mishishim, which is fine. But if you were to add these additional kernels that are in the straw, then it would come out that what you removed was even less than the 1 in 60. And normally we say that if a person doesn't even give the 1 in 60, what he gave us is ineffective, midrabanan. So we're going to see how we are to apply it in the case that we just mentioned, as we'll see inside the Gemara. Another part of the Mishnah, which we will still focus on today, is regarding Surya, as we learned yesterday. And indeed, we had a machlokes in our Mishnah. If the produce was under the ownership of a goy, when it reached oinas hamaisres, in our Mishnah, everyone agreed that part does not need to be tithed at all after you harvested the product. But what Rabbeinu HaKadosh, what Rabbi wrote in the Mishnah is that's fine. But all of the additional growth that happened after the Jew bought it, that has to be tithed. The Chachamim in our Mishnah hold that no, that since when it reached Oinas HaMaisres, it was under the ownership of a non-Jew. Don't forget, we're speaking about Surya. To begin with, product only has to be tithed rabbinically. In that case, you b'chlal don't have to tithe. The Gemara is going to quote a braisa that also will have a machlokes tanoim, different names, but this will be the machlokes, and we're going to expand and see how far does this machlokes go. And with that, without any further ado, I know today is Rosh Chodesh, so the class has to be a bit shorter. I apologize for coming on a bit late, but let's go. Better late than ever. So Daf Mem Aleph Amid Beis, second to last line. Again, the Mishnah says you're not allowed to sell untithed produce to a person who's nechshad, to a person who's not a chaver, even though it's attached, once the produce reached oinas hamaisres. So says the Gemara that there's a braisa, there's a tosefta that says Rabbi Shimon is mater. He allows you to sell untithed produce because it's attached. Now, really, there was another potential issue that Rab Shimon has to address. The fact that Rab Shimon argues with the issue of lifnei iver, I would say, is self-explanatory. Lifnei Iver, we all appreciate, it's like al derech marasayin. You can always say marasayin, but there are limits. However, the Chazal understood the limits. The same thing with Lifnei Iver. Same thing with Lifnei Iver. Imagine, I do business with a person who's not observant. How can I do business? He's going to earn money, God willing, we'll both earn money. He's going to take that money and buy treif. There has to be some point where you say it's too far removed. So the lifnei iver for Rab Shimon is self-understood. That produce is attached. What are you talking about? There isn't an obligation to separate tithes. I know this guy is not observant. I'm not selling him a detached. He's not going to eat it the way it is. But there's another potential issue. What's the other potential issue? The other potential issue is that I am preventing the Kohen and the Levi from getting their Trumas U'Maasros. In other words, is there such a thing? Am I causing loss? If I would remain the owner, or if I would sell it to a Jew that's observant in tithing, then the Kohen and the Levi will get from this their fair share. I don't want to use those words. Their share. Maybe there's a problem by me selling it, not because of Lifnei Iver. I'm causing loss. We don't say that. We don't say we're causing loss. Don't forget, I am not selling the portion of the Kohen. I am selling untithed produce that's attached. And I tell the Kohen or the Levi, I'm not causing you loss. Whatever is your part in this produce remains your part. Go and get it from the guy that bought it. Let's read it inside. So he's addressing that. The Pnei Shuhu Oymar Loi, who's the Loi? You look inside the last Rasher Ilyo, to the Kohen or to the Levi. This is only addressing why we don't view this as a causing a loss. Harei mocharti esheli. I am not selling your portion. I am selling what I own. What do I own? Attached produce. Say utva eshelcha. Go to the buyer and take that which is yours. That type of argument. Look inside the last marafulda. Harei machalti esheli. Shloi macharti lo yesa ma'aseh shem chalkacha. You can't claim that I am somehow selling your portion. Ella, what I am selling is, of course, chutz min ha'maasros. I believe in tithing. I don't expect, I would not have kept it myself, nor should the buyer keep it. Say yutva mimenu eshelcha. Okay, now I want to add, what is implied with Rab Shimon? If the produce is already detached, then selling it to the Kohen and to the Levi, according to Rab Shimon, first of all, it might be lifnei iver. That I don't know. But if I would sell it as it's detached, Rab Shimon will say it's prohibited because that's called causing loss to the Kohen and to the Levi. It's already detached. Even though there is no Gemar Malacha. It's amazing. In other words, cause, like lifnei iver, how many steps back do you need to be removed from a potential problem for me to be able to pick up my hands and say, I did nothing wrong? Okay, and we have to know how to apply this in many other areas. And on that note, Daf Mem Beis, now the Gemara says, now we're going back to our Mishnah. Okay, we put Rab Shimon to the side. We learned Rab Shimon. Our Mishnah does not allow you to sell attached produce if it reached Oinas HaMaasros to someone who is not Neman. Now, what happens if someone violated this rabbinic law? Avar umachar. This is if we subscribe to the Lifnei Iver. There are two different ways of understanding this Gemara. Again, to appreciate why in prior generations, people had a harder time learning the Yerushalmi. Because it's min hakotz el hakotz. It's mamish, you don't understand. I'm going to go with the second explanation of the Marafulda. You can already put your finger in the Marafulda, 6 lines from the top on the Lashon Acher. And he says that the Gemara is saying that if the person violated Shitas Chachamim, Ma'aser Eshuhu Oichel. It's shocking. Ma'aser Eshuhu Oichel. Look inside the Marafulda, Lashon Acher. Hachi Garsinon. The reason why there are different explanations is because there were different versions in the text. And we just read the Lashon Acher. I want to make it clear. In the Bavli also, you have a Gemara. Rashi understands it one way, Tosfos understands it the other way. But in the Bavli, everyone knows the words of the Gemara. The challenge we have in the Yerushalmi is if you don't know the words. So we're going to go with these words. You know what happens? The moicher is chayiv to tithe that which the loikeach bought. Now, we're not going to get into right now how you do that. It's not so simple, but it's doable. In other words, it's amazing. We penalized the seller by him now having to take from the seller's produce, obviously, from what is chayiv to be tithed. You can't be ma'aser min haptur al achiyuv. V'chulei, v'chulei, v'chulei. You got to do that. and you got to separate it. Okay, so there's a consequence. I violated lifnei iver. I have to fix what I did. I sold it to Chaim Yankel. Chaim Yankel is not that observant. He's not going to separate Trumas Meiser. Right? We're talking about a chashud. No one is chashud on Truma Gedoyla. So I, the seller, I have to separate the Trumas Meiser. Hold on. How far do we do this? What happens if I sold it to Chaim Yankel, which I shouldn't have, and Chaim Yankel sold it to Reuven? What do we say now? So the Gemara says that's the end of the line. The moment the buyer sold it to a third party, it's no longer the original seller's responsibility. The third party is buying it from a chashud. The third party is buying it from an ama'aretz. The third party is the one responsible for the produce that he's buying. He knows that he's buying it from someone who did not properly tithe it. Now the responsibility goes on the third party. That's the next line. But even though the seller, the way we're learning the Girsa, has to now out of his own pocket take off whatever needs to be taken off on behalf of the buyer, that the buyer is going to eat it. But if the buyer goes ahead and he resells it, now that he doesn't have to do. Why not? Ramai means someone who's dishonest. In this context, someone who's dishonest with Maisres. Who does the Ramai refer to? Says the Marafulder, to the third buyer, to the final buyer. The final buyer, everyone is expected to be responsible for themselves. So, in other words, if I buy produce from a person who's not a chaver, I need to know that. It's my responsibility. And what do I need to do? I have to take off Damai. That's the whole Masechtas Damai. And we can't argue, well, if the original guy wouldn't have sold it to Chaim Yankel, he never would have sold it to Reuven. We don't go that far. This is a very, very important Gemara. Once you understand the boundaries in its root, you have to now copy and paste this and apply this in all other cases. So there is a consequence for Lifnei Iver, but it's limited.
How does the seller know if the guy who sold it to is holding on to it, in which case he still has responsibility, versus if he sold it to another guy?
He has to find out. I would say that's his responsibility. And he'll want to find out because if it's going to be resold, he's off the hook. Person who wants to keep what the Gemara is saying, what Chazal is saying, he'll go find out.
He wasn't supposed to sell it in the first place, unpacked.
Correct, but we don't say now you're damned forever. We don't do that. It's good. It makes a lot of sense. Even if it wouldn't, then that's our problem. The second buyer, in other words, there's a rule. When I buy produce from an Ama'aretz,
when he sells it to a third buyer,
the final buyer, the current owner has to do it. The only time we say that the seller has to do it on behalf of the buyer is when the original seller was a chaver. He is abiding by the chachamim. He sold it to someone who he was not supposed to sell it to. So we penalize him only if that person still owns it. Okay, let's move on weiter. Now now we're going to the case of the straw, of the olive residue, the grape residue. As we explained, those items, the way they are, don't have to be tithed. But if the person extracts from the residue more liquid, if you take out of the straw kernels, those have to be tithed. So the Mishnah makes it clear what has to be tithed, only maisres. Yeah, anyone, whoever is going to extract from something that currently doesn't have to be tithed, but you take out of it oichel, so you're chayiv b'maisres, but you're patin min hatruma. The Mishnah was machadesh because the seller had in mind when he took off the truma gedoyla that it goes for everything, not only for the beautiful pile, but for the kernels that are stuck in the straw. V'chulei. So Tani, we learned in a Braisa, it's not that the person who took out, let me just give the example of the person who took out the kernels from the straw doesn't have to be toidim. No, he's not allowed to be toidim. Big difference. Now this is big, Alex. I know you're new to this. Truma doesn't have an amount. Biblically, it can be a nothing. It can be one kernel for the whole pile. It can be a large amount. But here's the thing. Once I separated Truma properly, by rabbinic law, let's say 2%, once I did that, I cannot later say, you know what, I'm going to add more. And when I say you can't do it, you cannot do it. You know why you cannot do it? Because after Truma, Everything else is untithed concerning Ma'aser Rishon. The Truma itself, the Kohen receives, and the Kohen eats as is. If I'm going to separate Truma, so I was misaken the Kri from Truma Gedoyla, then I decide, you know what, I want to give the Kohen more, and I separate another separation. If that separation is called Truma, but if that separation is really not Truma, because you were already tied him it. So now the Kohen is going to get it thinking it's Truma. The Kohen will eat it, and he's eating Tevel L'Maisres. So that's what the Baraisa says, that the intention that the original owner has, that when he's separating the 2%, it should include for all of these little pieces that are stuck in the residue. That is so powerful, that's so effective, that even if later you took out the kernels from the straw, you took out more oil from the residue, Lo Yitram, you're not allowed to separate it, because it's nothing. And you're going to call it Truma. You're going to give it to the Kohen. The Kohen is going to consume it, but the Kohen is eating something which really has to have Ma'aser Rishon removed from it. Now, really, that's a Braisa. But not everyone had this Braisa. People who did not have this Braisa had a machloikus about it. So the Gemara says, you have to know how they put it together. So before we quoted the Braisa, that's a Tana. Here we're quoting Amiroim. Machloikus. Rabbi Berechia Amar, Yafa Koichoi. Wow. We don't say that it's invalid. We say it's valid. And I'll tell you why it's valid. It's valid because it's not like you have a pile from which you separated Echad Mechamishim or whatever. And then you wake up tomorrow and you say, you know what, I want to give more. It's not the same. Because at the end of the day, I separated the 2% from the pile. The kernels that are being extracted now were never in the pile. They were in the straw. And the Chanami, the guy had in mind. So Rav Berechia understands it as, since he had in mind, it could be effective. But he doesn't consider it so effective. It's almost like if you're going to take out the kernels, let's use Bereda. So we say, retroactively, it was for that also. But the guy is not, this guy is saying, I don't want Bereda. So he understands it differently. But Rabbi Mana is an Amoida. Rabbi Mana is saying what the Braisa is saying. Lo yafa koichai. Why? Because if you're going to take off truma from those kernels, tuvla lemaiser. It's not truma. Really, it's tevel. The Kohen won't know that, so you're not allowed to do it. No, it's had Rav Berechia and Rav Mana known the Braisa, they wouldn't have argued. Then the Braisa would have been the accepted opinion. They didn't know that. That's the way we learn Pshat. Now the Gemara says the following. Rabbi Hananya, just to know, Rabbi, the famous Rabbi. Rabbi had a brother called Rabbi Hananya. And Rabbi Menachmeni. And Rabbi Hananya did not have the type of smicha that his chaverim had. Just to know how it worked. And Rabbi Hananya, so who was he? He was a chaver of the Rabbanan. I'm saying that because if he had smicha, he wouldn't be a chaver of the Chachamim. It would have been Rabbi Hananya asked his chaverim, asked the Chachamim. Chaver of the Chachamim means that he himself was not a Rabbanan. He was a chaver of the Rabbanan. And I know someone didn't want to get smicha. My father didn't want to. Why? Because he had chaverim who got smicha. He found that they're so ignorant. He told it to the Rebbe. He says, if they have smicha, I don't want this. That's I don't know if that's a good attitude. And the Rebbe told him to go get smicha anyways. So maybe Rabbi Hanania thought if this is the rabbis, I don't want to be part of them. But anyways, Rabbi Hanania chavran rabbanon boy taught him echad b'shishim. Oh, here's the kash. This person had the pile. And he was stingy. So he took the minimum amount, which is 1 of 60. Okay? Now, if you were to add the kernels in the straw, it's going to come out that what you took was even less. Shuhu echad mishishim ve'echad, if you add ala kitain, v'ala tzedodim, v'amashu b'toichat heaven. So we have a kasha. Now, what's the kasha? See, the Gemara doesn't elaborate. So look inside the Maraful. The Maraful is towards the end of the narrow lines, right? 3 lines before the bottom of the narrow lines. He speaks out both sides. This is amazing. Right? Hachi Garsina, and again, everyone with the gear says, Tadam echad mishishim shu echad mishishim ve'echad ala ketoin v'chulei. Kloimer, keshetach shev ala ketoin nami b'chlal l'cheshben atfua. If you're going to add a taka in, it's going to come out. Tiatruma, what you gave was not enough. It was going to be echad mishishim. But ve'im loy techashbein, if you won't add it in, that's really the machlokes Rabbi Berechia and Avmana. How do you view it? Then What you gave was taka echad mishish. Now, okay, what's the kasha? So Mahu explains, Amara Fulda, guys, we're going into the second line under the Gemara in the Mara. If we don't add the kernels, look at the logic. Want to hear this logic? If you don't add the kernels, so what you did was effective. Why is it effective? Because you didn't break rabbinic law. You gave the minimum amount. Once what you did is effective, look at the logic. Now we can say that all of this residual kernels that are legally insignificant don't have to be tithed, because for that, we can say, I don't need rabbinic law. For that, let me go back to the Torah law. What's the Torah law? That one kernel is good for everything. If you don't put them all together, then what you did is effective, not only for the Echad Mishishim. We're going to say what you did, first of all, was masak in the pile. Second of all, there's more straw. For that straw, I'm allowed to go back to Torah law. That's what the Mara says. If you don't combine them together, then I can argue that those ketuim will be exempted. Why? It's only the Rabbanan that said that even a person who's ayin ra, he has to give echad mishishim and not less. He cannot give shishim be'echad. But he didn't give shishim echad. He kept the rabbinic law. But if you're going to mamish always add all of those kernels, which will be more like Rav Mana, more like if you add them in, so then you can't separate them. So then what you gave was less than the echad mishishim. If what you gave is less than echad mishishim, you know what you did? What you did is not effective. Then none of it was mesukan. It's either all mesukan or none of it is mesukan. That's the way the Mara Fulda understands the inquiry. And for that, Amar Rabbi Yosi, V'lav Masnisahi, is that not really hinted to by our Mishnah? Now we're quoting the words in our Mishnah. The Mishnah is saying, Shah toirem beliboy al hakiti'in v'al tzadodem al mashutei chatevet. Says Rabbi Yosi, our case of the Mishnah must be speaking about this case. If not, there's not a chiddush. If not, there's not even a chiddush. Our Mishnah is speaking about someone who is giving the minimum amount, echad mishishim, speaking about someone who gave the echad mishishim from the kri, and you have more than that, which would render your truma less than echad mishishim. If you were to count everything that's out there, that's not in the pile, that's in the v'chuli, and that's the vart of the Mishnah. Klum tziricha. Would the Mishnah even need to tell you that? The reason why the Mishnah is telling you that is ela b'yasir. Only indeed in this case, where if you were to add it, you would have more, and then what you gave would have been insignificant. That's based on the premise that the Mishnah wouldn't even have to say it. It would be so self-understood. So from the fact that Rabbeinu HaKadosh needed to spell out Berachal B'Tchak Tana is a raya, according to Rabbi Yosi, that what you did is effective. My understanding of all this, I just want to go back, that like in the Babli, normally an Amoida cannot argue with the Tana. Here we have a Rabbi Berechia, he argues with the Braisa. Maybe I can word it now. Maybe that's why Rav Berechia is not refuted from the Braisa, because Rav Berechia is leaning on the Mishnah. And based on this understanding that we don't include it, if we don't include it, then if you decide later to be Toidem, you don't have to. You can't say that you're giving to the Kohen a Tevel Maisris, because it wasn't included. A person has the right to say it might be objectively insignificant, for which you can rely on the minimum din Torah, but I want to keep what the Chachamim said. I want to give a truma from everything. Maybe that's the word. Okay, gewaltig. Okay, now we're moving on to the other part of the Mishnah, which is a person buying a field in Surya. Number one, midrabanan, produce of Surya has to be tithed. Midrabanan, not midoiraisa, because we consider it kibush yachid. Number two, lakula alma yesh king and laakum lahafki. In other words, if a goy owns it, then you don't have to. It doesn't have to be tithed. And what the Mishnah explained was owning it when? Oinas hamaisris. That's the link in the Mishnah. The only thing we had in the Mishnah, we had a machlekes, and our Mishnah, the Tanakama and Rabbi. We're going to have the same machlekes with different names. The Tanakama holds that if it belonged to a guy during Oinas hamaisris, then he sold it to a Jew. Let's go with Oinas hamaisris by grain, vadai shlish. And then the Mishnah says the Jew doesn't have to harvest it right away. He can let it grow to its full size, which actually would mean that it's going to grow another 2 shlishim under the ownership of a Jew. Says the Tanakama of our Mishnah, none of it has to be tithed. For that, Rabbi says, no. You don't have to tithe the original. But the other 2/3 have to be tithed. Now, hold these names and let's go on the Gemara. Tani, we learned in Abraisa, we learned in Abraisa, Gewalt late, that Sada Shivia Shlish Lifnei Goy, the word Shlish is clearly so by grain. So let's speak about grain. Lifnei Goy means while it was under the possession of the non-Jew, and only then Olokachlam and Yisrael. So Rabbi Akiva will be like the Tanakama in our Mishnah. Now we know the Tanakama of our Mishnah is not the Chachamim, it's Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva Oimed, even the Tosefes will be exempt. Mamish the Tanakama. And it's funny, over here in the Braisa, who is like Rabbi, the majority opinion. The Chachamim Oimrim, no. Yes, that what belonged to the Goy doesn't have to be tithed. But for Hatosefes Chayv, I just want to make one thing clear. If I, a Jew, bought it from the Goy before it hit Oinas HaMaisres, I have to be ma'ased all of it. Okay. So now we have Machlekes Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. Now, how are we to understand it? We are to understand it that they are debating on the power of Oinas HaMaisres. How significant is this Oinas HaMaisres? Rabbi Akiva gives it a lot of significance. Yeah, it belonged to a guy, but Oinas HaMaisres, it completely excluded from it. The Chachamim don't hold that there's such a strong link. You're right, that which belonged to the guy is exempt, but it doesn't completely remove it. Based on that, how significant is Oinas HaMaisres? That's a simple way of wording it. Says the Gemara, we're going to have twice. Rav Avina, in the name of Ula Bar Yishmael, in the name of Rabbi Lazar, this is the first time today in today's daf, he says the following, that Af Chachamim Loichivu B'Toisefes. Okay, you got to give on Toisefes. But don't tell me that Oinas HaMaisres is Bechlal not significant. It is significant for another rule. The determinant of what year does it belong to? By grain, I know we just recently spoke. By vegetables, it's when you harvest it. That's the year, whether it's the second year or the third year. Sheni or ani. By legumes, when it took root. By fruit, chanata. Bachloikes b'shama b'silal, right? Tu b'shvat. By grain, a third. By grain, the Oinas HaMaisres is the determinant of the year. So the Gemara is saying, B'Shem Rabbi Lazar, even though the Chachamim don't give as much significance to Oinas HaMaisres, like Rabbi Akiva, but don't say it's nothing. It's very significant, which is that Av Chachamim Leichiva B'Teisefes Elo L'Sha'avar. In other words, all of it, if Shloime, even the Toisefes has to be tithed. But the Tosefes has to be tithed based on when did it hit Oinas HaMaisres, in what year. If it hit Oinas HaMaisres in the second year, don't forget, that which hit Oinas HaMaisres, you b'chlal don't tithe. You only have to tithe on the additional. Even if all of the 2/3 grew in the third year, I don't care. It's going to all be Meiser Shenid, not Meiser Onid. Or the same thing is, if it goes from the third to the fourth, and it reached Oinas HaMaisres in the third year. The Tosefes was only in the fourth. Doesn't matter. Ani. So in other words, it's not as significant as it is. Let Rabbi Akiva, the Chachamim who hold, I'm going to the Chachamim, slicha, that the Chachamim that say you have to be ma'aser the Tosefes, the Chachamim and Rabbi, don't simplify it by saying the Chachamim don't give such weight to Oinas HaMaisres. They do. All of it will be determined by the Oinas HaMaisres concerning the year. It's not that consistent, but we can live with it. Now, says the Gemara, Daf Mem Beis Amud Beis, we are going to apply l'chu'ura, the same rule when it comes to Svichei Shvi'is. Let me go back to the simple rule of Svichim. Svicha means after growth. Svicha means a product that has spontaneous growth, okay, grew without it being planted. And midrabanan, in many cases, or maybe even in most cases, sficha may not be consumed. So we learned in Abraisa, this is from Rabbi Yonasan, but Rabbi Yosi Oimer, the initial understanding, minayin litvua shevi ashlish. How do you know that if grain reached this Oinas HaMaisres lifnei Rosh Hashanah, and then it grew 2 other thirds in the 7th year, that it's not restricted as svichei shviz? It's not svichim. You can take it. Now, there are other rules. You can't gather it to sell it. When it comes to Shvius, we learned the whole Masechta Shvius, but it's not Tzvicha. That coin soisa b'Shvius. How do you know that? So Talmud loimer v'asafta es tvuasa b'Shvius. So if I want you to look in the Torah Eira Shalom quickly, and we're going to go with Psukim and Parshas Bahar, because really these words v'asafta es tvuasa, you have both in Parshas Mishpatim and you have in Parshas Bahar. What we're going to add, I'm just adding what the Noise Kalim say over here, that this is a really Chassidish Torah. First of all, we're going with Bahar. So I want you to read the pasuk in Bahar. Shei shanim tiz rasodecha, v'shei shanim tiz mar karmecha. And during the 6 years, v'asafta tivuasa. Then it says in the next pasuk, ubashana hashviis. And in the 7th year, Shabbos Shabbosin yelo aretz. Ubashana hashviis. So the vav is machaber. So we're going to read it, v'asafta es tivuasa bashana hashviis. That there is a scenario where even it's the 7th year, and even though on the 7th year, midrabanan, there's a Isur Svichim, there are times that you could gather the Tfuah Bashana Shvis. When? If it hit a Shlish before Rosh Hashanah, Laha'ir, Svichim is Asur Derabanan. So this cannot be the Pshat. This is called an Asmachta. In other words, you can't have a Remez in the Torah on a certain level for rabbinic law. Midairaisa, there's no issue with Svichim. But it's fine. Huh? If Tfuah grew on its own, Tfuah could be Svichim. Okay, in our case, think about it. Huh? That's why people have a hard time learning Yerushalmi. So that's what they all say over here. Now, says the Gemara, second time today, Rab Avina, in the name of Ula, Bar Yishmael, in the name of Rabbi Lazar. This is what he understands. Rabbi Yonasan Berebi saying that Asya the Rabbi Yonasan Berebi Beshitas Rabbi Akiva Rabbi. When it comes to Talmidei base Rabbi Akiva, how many Talmidim did he have at the end? We say 5 Talmidim. Really, it could be 6 Talmidim. Let's go with the 5 Talmidim. Here you see other Talmidim. Now, whether this Rabbi Yonasan Berebi Yosi passed away during that period, I don't think so. I think the Rabbi Yosi, I think that's Rabbi Yosi ben Chalaft. I think it's one of his 5 Talmidim. Anyways, Asya the Rabbi Yonasan Berebi B'Shitas Rabbi Akiva Rabbi. He's making a link. Listen to these words. What's the link? That just like Rabbi Akiva says, when it comes to what we learned in our Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva's the Chachamim, that the 2/3 don't have to be tithed. Why is that? Because Oynas HaMaisres is that weighty. Wow, it's Oynas HaMaisres, it's everything. Okay, so that fits. So Oynas HaMaisres determines that this Tfuah belongs to the 6th year. There's no Svichei Shvius. That Achashlish, Horishan, At Mahalach, period. Kach, Rabbi Yonasan, Rabbi Yosi Omer, Achashlish, Horishan, At Omer. Now we have a contradiction. What's the contradiction? We just said the opposite. We just said that when it comes to the determinant, we just said that. Who said it? Rabbi Avina. That even the Chachamim hold that the determinant of the year, even lachachamim, it contradicted each other. So it says the Gemara, you just said 2 things and one contradicts the other. And you just contradicted yourself. Hacha means the first case. What did you just say? That even the chachamim that say that you have to tithe the second 2/3, even they agree that when it comes to the determinant of the year, it only follows the Oynas HaMaisres. And he's just repeating the words. Shema Yisheni Sheni, and if it was Ani Ani. And right now you're telling me that the Rabbi Yonasan, the Rabbi Yosi follows Rabbi Akiva. It's not true. According to you, Rabbi Yonasan, Rabbi Yosi can even follow the Chachamim. It's not linked. You're telling me that Asya, the Rabbi Yonasan, Rabbi Yosi, we should be about Rabbi, contradicts himself. Eloma, says the Gemara, Ida Asya. We're not negating the fact that Rabbi Lazar said these words, but you misunderstood what he's saying. You know what he said? If Rabbi Yonasan, Ida Asya, that B'Shem Rabbi Lazar, a statement was made that Rabbi Yonasan Rabbi Yosi follows B'Shitas Rabbi Akiva Rabbi, you misunderstood it. Don't apply it to the Brisa that you said. Apply it to something else. Come on, Rabbi Akiva Omar, as Rabbi Akiva said, that what? Rabbi Akiva holds Isur Svichim are Torah. Wow. The fact that Rabbi Yonasan Berebi is taking Psukim in Bahar. Let's go with the way we learned it, right? That for the 6 years, v'asaftas tfuasa, and then we make the link. Ubashana hashviz, you gather it in the 6th and in the 7th. We're not going with it's a rabbinic, it's an asmachti. He's making a limud. Why? How can he quote psukim in the Torah to tell you dinim benegeya svichim? Svichim is not connected to the Torah. Nah, that's what he said. If he said, no. You see that he holds like Rabbi Kiva Rabbi. Kach Rabbi Rabbi holds Amar Isur Svichim are midoiraisa, which is why we use psukim to clarify or to limit the Isur Svichim.